How ready is Oklahoma for the SEC? That's Jay Smith, newest co-host of Locked On Sooners, joining me here on the show. He was just here at SEC Media Days, missed him by just that much for the segment, but that's why technology is so great, because there's nobody I'd rather ask this question to, Jay. How ready is Oklahoma to go to the SEC and win games immediately?
First and foremost, Spencer, thank you so much for having me. Definitely a pleasure to meet you as well as be there at SEC Media Days. It was awesome. And to answer that question, it's been the question asked the most probably at the Media Days. Everybody's asking and wondering, is Oklahoma ready? They don't really ask about Texas, which is always fascinating, but they're asking, is Oklahoma ready? And I'm going to say yes. I think we are ready to begin winning games. I think we're ready to start competing, because there's two metrics to really look at when it comes to teams competing, right? The first thing to look at is going to be the blue chip ratio. That dropped from CBS. They've been keeping track of that since 2013, and it kind of gives them an idea of the teams, usually the 16 teams that's really going to be able to compete for a championship. Oklahoma is in the top 8, 73% blue chip ratio. I'm sorry, 74%. My apologies. I don't want to disrespect us. Guess who's right behind us? Texas. They're 73. So it's either we're 74 and they're 73, or they're 73, we're 72. It's in that range. We're just, we don't have to be exact sometimes, but we're 1% higher than them in the blue chip ratio. That should tell you kind of where we are as far as being prepared. And the other
you could say we are the 1%.
Yeah, there you go. We'll go for it, right? We're the 1% better than them. And to go with that, you have recruiting classes, right? We've had top-tier recruiting classes every year that Venables has been here, and a few years before. So because we're recruiting at a very high level and we have a very high blue chip ratio, I sense that we're going to be prepared. All we got to do is execute on the field.
Yeah, I look at where Oklahoma was a season ago, and I thought their defense made some just massive strides from the first year. I thought that goal line stand against Texas was the defining moment of the Brent Venables era to this point. And of course, that win is the biggest win that he has had to date as Oklahoma's head coach. I think it's a fair question to ask. Oklahoma fans might be tired of hearing it, but you heard Jordan Rodgers, who's covered the SEC for a long time, earlier on today's show, talk about how when you go to the SEC, it is a step up, because you have guys that are not just bigger oftentimes or stronger. They have a greater combination of all these athletic traits. You can call it SEC bias all you like. I've said for a long time, Jay, two things about SEC bias. One, it is very real. You are not imagining things. SEC bias is 100% real. Number two, it's 100% deserved. How else do you react to the conference that has the highest rate of recruits, that has the most NFL draft picks, that wins the most championships? Of course, that's a fair question to ask for teams coming from the Big 12, which typically plays a different style of football across the board. So let's go elsewhere. In the trenches, feels like Oklahoma will be solid at least. But what about the rest of the positions? How ready do you think Jackson Arnold is to take on the SEC?
Yeah, let's start with him at quarterback, right? So Jackson Arnold, 5-star plus quarterback. So every single recruiting site made him a 5-star, coming out of Denton Guyer, just north of where you are currently in the Dallas Metroplex. And, Gatorade National Player of the Year. He's gotten all these accolades and awards. He did well. He's Elite 11 MVP. I mean, you name it, he's kind of won it. Now, do those things really define success? Not really, right? We've seen the list of last Elite 11 winners as well as National Gatorade Player of the Years, and it's a hit and miss type setup, right? It all depends on if you're set up for success at the team you go to, right? Jackson Arnold, I believe, will be fine. He's being forged in fire, which is fantastic for him. And you mentioned this before, Brent Venables' defense, we've seen the growth year after year underneath him. This is a similar trajectory that he had in his first stint at Oklahoma, as well as his stint at Clemson. Within the first 3 years, that defense flew in the top 5. And that's exactly top 5 to top 10, right? I think Oklahoma was top 10, Clemson was top 5. And that's how he trajects right now, right? We moved into the 50s, into the 20s and 30s as far as efficiencies go. And now we're pushing ourselves. We should have a top 10 defense this year. There's no excuse for it. Mainly because in the SEC, offenses aren't very proficient outside of Alabama, when they were doing things, and LSU when they had that
I've
absurd
seen Tennessee
season.
score a few points
Tennessee
here and
can
there.
score
Ole
some
Miss moves the
points.
ball up and down the field pretty
Ole Miss
well.
does now with the Lane train, but I'm talking about, and that's in the last couple of years. I'm talking about it kind of historically, right? That's kind of the thing that made Alabama jump out, especially when they brought in Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian, offensive coordinators. They changed the game, and their offenses got ridiculous. Before, it was run it down their throat and just pound them, pound, nonstop. Then they opened it up. That's when you start to see the influence of the Big 12. Some of the Big 12 offensive coaches started shifting over. Saw Mike Leach, rest in peace, went over to Mississippi State, putting up numbers. Lane Kiffin comes from underneath the Norm Chow tree. That was a lot of high-octane offenses. And so, same thing with Sarkisian. And so, Saban saw the writing on the wall, so he made those adjustments. But for the most part, a lot of teams in the SEC don't do that outside of like a Tennessee, historically, because even talking to the Auburn guys, it's always funny. They made mention of, it's like they've had 3,000-yard passers in the school's history. I think we've had maybe 2 players not throw for 3,000 yards in the last 20 years. So every year we're numbers guys. We're that's
a Big 12 SEC difference at some level.
Right, exactly, right. And you're starting to see that shift around the country too, right? That's kind of becoming the thing. NFL is the exact same way, right? It's all about offensive-minded guys leading the way and just throwing up numbers. But we have a defensive-minded coach where his focus is stopping offenses like that. And being that we're now in the 3rd year of his system and a lot of the players have returned, 86% of his production is back, the entire goal is for him to put himself in a position for a top defense. So Jackson Arnold, himself as quarterback, he'll be fine. He's being forged in fire. He's going against one of the best defenses in the country. Phil Steele lists our linebacker room as well as our safety room as the number 2 rooms in college football. Number 1 in the SEC, number 2 in college football. So we have second best secondary, second best linebacker group, and it's all because of how many veterans are on there, right? With Danny Stutzman leading the way, and then Billy Bowman in the secondary. You got Willie Washington coming back. Gentry Williams had a fantastic breakout year last season. Bringing in a transfer like Des Malone from San Diego State, who started 2 seasons there, who's very good in the zone, especially at like 6'1", 6'2", running almost a 4.5 40. Oklahoma's building that part. Now, the trenches is where the questions lie, right? I don't have concerns. I have questions. Size-wise, we're getting there. We have about 6 dudes over 295 pounds, 3 dudes over 300 pounds right now on the defensive line, especially at the tackle spot. That's critical in the SEC. You don't want to have one dude at 300 pounds playing all the time because he ain't going to make it. Not through a grueling conference where you're dealing with a 300-pound offensive lineman all the time, right? Offensive line-wise, everybody on our offensive line is over 300 pounds minimum, and most of our guards are 310 pounds plus. So we've got size. We ain't got Alabama size.
Right.
That kind of felt like a problem for them last year, if you really think about it.
So I want to make sure we have time to wrap up today's show to talk about the Texas game, because I mentioned that earlier on today's show as maybe the game that will define whether or not Texas plays for the SEC championship. I'm just so very bullish on Georgia, and I don't think that Georgia and Texas are going to match up in the SEC championship game. It's possible. It's just they'd have to go combine probably 5-1, maybe 4-2 across 6 games that are exceedingly difficult, and one of them, of course, is against each other. How capable is Oklahoma of beating Texas again? Because I think a lot of people look, it feels with the way these two teams get discussed, like Oklahoma hasn't beaten Texas in 5 years, and yet they beat them just, a season ago.
Right, and Oklahoma's 5-6 in the last 6 games, right? 7-7 of the last 13. I mean, we can go back all the way to the last 20 years. Oklahoma's owned this series, right? But just in the Sarkisian era, our Steve Sarkisian is 1-2 against Oklahoma since he's been there at Texas. And this year's game is going to be probably the most critical one. Like last year for Oklahoma, it was very critical because, Venables needed to really plant himself here. Well, now this year's, the big problem for Texas is that not only do they get Oklahoma, they got Georgia right after them at home. That's going to be a grueling 2-game setup. Now, granted, they have a bye week before Oklahoma, just like Oklahoma has a bye week before Texas. But, man, imagine the physicality in that game. Last year, if you watched the game, Oklahoma was pushing Texas around the entire game. Texas was able to do that to Alabama, right? That should tell you what the trench work, and that should tell you kind of how good the defense can be for Oklahoma. We could have won that game by double digits. We made the mistake of giving up a defensive touchdown where they blocked the punt in the back of the end zone because, unfortunately, our offensive coordinator made some decisions that were always questionable at that part of the field, right? Well, because of that, you still won the game 34-30, but we led the entire game up until the end of the fourth quarter, and then we made the game-winning drive to close it out. That should tell you kind of what we expect this coming season. Oklahoma has it in their mind. It's obvious. We care about that game way more than Texas does, and our goal is to make sure we become the spoiler for them.
Well, I think Texas might push back on the notion that Oklahoma cares even more because, well, that's what rivalries are all about. I care more.
Exactly.
No, you care more. We're better. No, we're better than you, and such. That's what July is for, and that is Jay Smith. Locked on Sooners. Check him out. Jay, appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, Spencer.
Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time, and until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.